The third kind of policies we have are what we call macro-prudential policies. And remember that those policies are things like stress tests on banks, things that the Fed does to try to keep banks from getting into trouble. So just this morning, Jamie Dimon, who's the head of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon says, our balance sheet is a fortress. In other words, when the financial crisis happened in 2007, 8, 9, the balance sheets of these banks were terrible. They were stretched to the limit, right? They were leveraged to everything they could possibly be leveraged to, and they had no backup when bad things happen and the government has to step in. Now, because of these macro-prudential policies, these big banks aren't going to be in financial trouble. They're capable of making loans. They're sitting there. They're operating normally. Okay? So these macro-prudential policies work, even though, again, we'll see what happens over time. Jay Powell, the current chair of the Federal Reserve, is less a fan of these than Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen, his predecessors, were. But anyway, we shall see. Okay? Here's the problem with monetary policy. You can't force people to take out loans. Congress can't pass a law and tell me I must buy a new car and borrow the money. What happens if banks stop making loans or people stop asking for loans? Well, you can't force them. Okay? Economists use this phrase about pushing on a string. You can pull on a string and make the ball of yarn move, but you can't push the string and make the ball move. Okay? So sometimes monetary policy is like pushing on a string. There's money out there, you're doing what you can, but people in banks, animal spirits, right? People in banks are scared. They're scared. And so they don't make loans or they don't ask for loans, and there's no way to force them, right? Yogi Berra, the baseball player, was famous for saying that if nobody wants to come to the game, there's no way you can make them, right? It's the same deal. If your team sucks and nobody comes to watch it, you can't make people come watch the game. Okay, industrial policy. If you've driven to California, hopefully you haven't done that in the last 2 weeks, but if you've ever driven from here to California, you know that there's a big solar power plant. This is not it, but there's a big solar power plant right at the border of Nevada and California. Okay? That solar power plant is the result of what we call industrial policy. So industrial policy, we target specific industries, we deregulate things for specific industries. Japan, Korea, China, they're really good at this. Really good at this. Germany, really good at this. Target industries. The United States sucks at it. Okay? The Obama administration was big on solar power, and that plant there wouldn't exist if the Obama administration hadn't made arrangements to help solar power installations get going and improve and all that, blah, blah, blah. The Trump administration doesn't care about solar. President Trump said, too many birds are killed in solar and wind and stuff. And so they've been deregulating things that relate to coal and deregulating things that relate to oil and trying to push the coal industry and the oil industry. Okay? But either way, we're not very good at it, right? The coal industry, despite the fact the Trump administration did a whole bunch of things to help the coal industry, they had record bankruptcies last year. Okay? And the oil industry, prices are way down. World demand is way down. Lots of oil companies in the United States, smaller oil companies in the United States, could die over the next year if prices don't go back up. Okay? So you can ask the question, instead of having a trade war with China, why didn't we just implement industrial policy? Right? If we're upset that we're buying so much from China, instead of putting barriers up and saying, hey, buy our stuff, don't buy our stuff, maybe we could have just done industrial policy and tried to get domestic industries, competitive domestic industries going without the government buys a lot of stuff, right? What if the government passed a law and said everything that the military uses, they can't use anything made in China. Can't use anything made in Russia in the military. They have to use things that are made in the U.S. Well, that would start up an industrial base in the United States for certain products that doesn't exist right now, right? So there's ways that industrial policy could be used, but again, we're just not very good at it. And so maybe we don't want to try those things. I don't know. Okay, so I should be singing a Beatles song to you, you know. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Well, the French let it be is laissez-faire, keep your hands off. So if you're Adam Smith and what's going on now is going on now, Adam Smith would have said, you know, the best thing you could have done is have the government do nothing. The government should stay out of this. Okay? When the financial crisis hit, and we already talked about this before, but when the financial crisis hit, people like Paul Ryan, who was Speaker of the House, and Rand Paul, who's, you know, Senator from Kentucky, they kept talking about the discipline of the market and saying in 2007, 8, and 9 that the economy would be better off if the government did nothing. Let banks fail that were going to fail. Let General Motors fail. Let Bank of America or Wells Fargo fail if they had to. Let Chrysler fail. Let all these companies just go bankrupt, and something better would rise up. Okay? And it would happen quicker, and the economy would recover quicker, and in the end, there'd be less pain and suffering, even though maybe the pain and suffering in the short term would be worse. All right? That theory depends on there being flexible wages and prices in the economy, a great deal of competition in the economy, and flexible wages and prices. And we know that that's maybe not the best assumption. But they're going to answer no to all those questions. Classical economists and modern new classical economists are going to say, look, the government shouldn't interfere in the economy. Most of the time, the government can't do anything. Okay? It's interesting to note that while we sit here and all these people are going, discipline the market, don't do this, government shouldn't interfere, the $2 trillion spending package they just put together basically passed unanimously in the Senate and almost unanimously in the House. So lots of people who spend their days making those arguments about the power of the free market, when things get really bad, they become Keynesians all of a sudden. And a lot of that may have to do with the fact that they realize that there's not competition in the marketplace and wages and prices just are not exactly flexible. Okay? So here's a picture of our buddy Keynes, and you can read this if you're really bored. Pause me. Basically, he says, look, the way to get out of the Depression is to bury bottles of money and let people dig them up. And it may be better if we could just take that money we were going to use to bury and we would just build houses, but politically you can't do that, and so burying money is better than doing nothing. Okay? He believes the government has to interfere, not all the time, but during crises, the government needs to get involved in the economy. Okay, so the Keynes himself, the Keynesians, the new Keynesians, they all believe in government intervention. Not all in the same way, but they all believe in government intervention. They believe that there are times when monetary policy works, there are times when fiscal policy works. But to solve a problem like we're in now, a Keynesian would say the government must act, the government has to step in. Okay? And you could say, well, the economy is in bad shape because we forced everybody to stay home. Well, let's suppose we hadn't forced everybody to stay home. And all of a sudden, 80% of the country gets this virus and 2 million people die. We still would have businesses shutting down. We still wouldn't have people on airplanes. People would still be scared to go to it, right? And so economists who have studied this have suggested that the economic badness would actually be worse. Now, a classical economist would say, well, yeah, but maybe then we'd all be immune and we'd have worse pain for 6 months instead of lesser pain for 18 months. And it's hard to argue one way or another, but it's scarier for people to say, especially if you're running for office, it's scarier to say, yeah, you're going to let 2 million people die to keep a recession from coming. That might cost you votes. So this whole thing is really complex, and there's no counterfactual, right? You can say, hey, it would have been better if we had done this, but there's no way to prove it. So those arguments, there's arguments about what should have happened at the beginning of the Great Depression. Those arguments have been going on now for 90 years. Well, there's no way to solve them because you don't have a time machine and you can't go back in time and try something different and see how it goes, and then go back again and try something different. So you're just hypothesizing, and there's no way to know. It might have been better, but there's no way to know. Okay. So, 2 basic kinds of recessions. The most common kind of recession is the one I put at the bottom, which is a demand recession. A demand recession is called that because it's caused by aggregate demand. In a demand recession, real GDP falls, prices also fall. Prices don't necessarily have to go down. Inflation can just go away. But demand recession, both real GDP and prices go down. On very rare occasions, we have what are called supply recessions. In a supply recession, we get inflation and unemployment both at the same time. Real GDP goes down, but prices are going up. So we have the worst of both worlds. People are losing their jobs, and the prices they're having to pay for things go up. On this beautiful chart here, this is the only supply recession. So this is the up and down of the economy from 1945 to the present. Not quite to the present because obviously we don't have data for the last month, but you get the idea. This is quarterly. This is every 3 months, so there's no dot out here. But we could, if we believe people, this line's going to go like down to there in the next dot. But let's just hang on for that for a minute. So we can go back and look. This line here is the dividing line. Above it is expansion, and below it is contraction or recession. Where these colored bars are, those are the official recessions. So it's possible, like right there and right there, we have a contraction, but it's not a recession. But most of the time when we have a contraction, when we're below the line, it's a recession. And what you should note, again, we talked about this great moderation. So draw that line right there. To the left of that line, we have a lot more going on down here, right? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 recessions. 8 recessions in 40 years. And then we have 1, 2, 3 in the next 40 years. Okay? And these guys are little tiny baby things. These guys are generally pretty big. This is the only big one. So we had one big one here against 1, 2, 3, 4. So a lot less downtime, a lot fewer recessions, a lot more up. But look at the ups. That's as high as we get now, right? Used to be a lot higher. Look at this. This guy's over 15. That guy's over 15. That guy, that guy, that guy, that guy, that guy. They're all over 10. If we look at this, here's 5. Sorry, it's not a very straight line. George Bush was over 5 twice. Obama was over 5 once. Trump hasn't hit 4 yet. Okay? So it was regular, normal back here to be over 5. We were over 5 at least half the time. We were over 5% growth, right? So 5%. The economy is growing at 5%. At least half the time we were over 5%. Now We've been over 5% 3 times in 20 years. 20 years is 80 quarters. So 3 quarters of the last 80 quarters, we've been over 5%. Okay? So, and you're saying, well, do we care? Well, here's what I'll tell you. There's this magic number, which is the magic number of 70. If you want to figure out how long it takes your income to double, you take 70 and you divide by how fast your income is growing. So if your income, and GDP is our income, right? If our income is growing at 5% a year, that means our GDP is going to double every 14 years. Okay? If our GDP on average is growing by half of that, if our GDP on average is growing by 2.5%, then our GDP is going to double every 28 years. And we'd much rather have it double every 14 than every 28. Okay? So the great moderation, yeah, we have fewer recessions, less up and down swings in the economy, less inflation, but also less economic growth. Okay? So we have this diversion of these two periods of time. Okay? And you can argue that the Federal Reserve had a lot to do with this, because this is where the Fed decides that interest rates are the most important thing, right? Over this way, the Federal Reserve is primarily focused on interest rates, and over this way, the Federal Reserve is primarily focused on the money supply. Okay. Are we good there? All right. So Keynes says the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. People don't like to change. Okay? All right, so what do we do to fight a demand recession? Right now, we're about to go into a demand recession. It's going to be a really nasty demand recession. Okay? Hopefully short, but really nasty. What do we do? Well, fiscal policy for that is to increase spending and cut taxes. Have we done that? Yes. We just passed a bill, and it's got $2 trillion in spending in it, and it's got some tax cuts in it. Fiscal policy. That's exactly what Keynes would have you do. Monetary policy, you increase the money supply and lower interest rates. Have we done that? Yep. So the Fed's out there buying stuff, easing, quantitative easing, like $4 trillion worth, and interest rates have dropped to 0. Exactly what you're supposed to do. Okay? So you're living in a moment where there's this huge demand recession, and the government response is exactly what it's supposed to be. Not the details, right? I don't think Keynes imagined that they'd be passing 800-page laws that are full of all this complicated stuff, right? They could have passed and done basically the same thing with a 30-page law that was a whole lot less complex, but it wouldn't have presence in it for everybody. So, politics be politics. Okay? All right, so what do you do if you have inflation? Well, it turns out that you do exactly the opposite thing if there's inflation. So the fiscal policy for inflation would be to cut spending and raise taxes, and the monetary policy for inflation is to lower the money supply and raise interest rates. So something should occur to you, and that's that the thing to do in a demand recession is exactly the opposite of the thing to do with inflation. The thing to do in a demand recession is exactly the opposite of the thing to do in inflation. So what happens if we have a recession and inflation at the same time? What happens if it's 1973, 74, and we have a supply recession? And in that supply recession, not only are people losing their jobs, but inflation's bad. The things you do to fight the recession are going to make inflation worse. The things you do to fight inflation are going to make the recession worse. There's no economic skill, no economic idea we have of what you do if there's a supply recession, right? Which makes us very happy that there isn't one very often, that they don't often happen. What did we end up doing? Well, the Federal Reserve raised that interest rate, which is currently 0, the discount rate and the Fed funds rate that are currently 0, they raised them to 14. 14% interest rates from the government. So imagine that you go out to buy a car and they're charging you 20%. You buying a car? That's a no. Imagine that you go out to buy a house and they're charging you 17 or 18%. You buying the house? Yeah, that'd be a no. Okay? So what the Federal Reserve did, the Federal Reserve intentionally, and it's this Paul Volcker guy who did this, who's the Volcker rule, and he worked with Carter, and he worked for Reagan, and he worked for Obama. Okay? So again, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be politically independent, right? And I keep saying this. It's supposed to be politically independent. Paul Volcker worked for Carter, Reagan, and Obama. Tell me anybody else who would do that. And the answer is there's nobody, right? Reagan didn't keep any of Carter's people. The Democrats didn't keep any of Reagan's people when they got the White House back. And yet, someone like Paul Volcker, who's chair of the Federal Reserve, he can work for three very different presidents with three very different political ideas. Okay? Independent. Political independence of the Fed is very importante. Okay? So we get rid of supply recession by turning it into demand recession. Paul Volcker did this. We had a horrible recession. Horrible recession. Yes, you're like, wait, it's a mess. But take this thing right here, this recession right here. Can we see that? Do I need to put that in a different color? Can I blue that? That recession right there, that recession. The Federal Reserve caused that recession to get rid of the inflation. We were having double-digit inflation. Between 75 and 80, the price of everything in the United States doubled. We were having 10%, 12%, 13% inflation a year. The Federal Reserve caused that recession to get rid of the inflation. And in large part, it made Ronald Reagan president and got rid of Jimmy Carter. Okay? Because of the recessions that were going on.